Hey everyone, this is a piece by Clemens Nachtmann. The description of Clemens Nachtmann says he's a professor for harmony and counterpoint at the University of Fine Arts Graz. Clemens Nachtmann works as a composer and author. Among his books are Kritik der Politik in 2000, as well as Geduld und Ironie in 1995. I don't know if that's not a very satisfactory. I don't know if that feels. It doesn't feel like a very satisfactory uh, introduction to the guy. There we are, German Wikipedia. It says that in contribution to the journal Bahamas, on whose editorial board he served, Clemens Nachtmann sharply criticized academic anti-racism and critical whiteness research, among others. Furthermore, in political writings published by Ka Ira, among others, Nachtmann repeatedly examined the concept of the German Volksstaat in comparison with other forms of Western statehood. He's part of the Academic Freedom Network, which is an association founded in 2020 of scientists mainly researching and teaching at German universities who have set themselves the goal of defending academic freedom enshrined in the Basic Law against what they believe to be ideologically motivated restrictions. So, that's who Clemens Nachtmann is. And the piece we're reading today is titled Identity Politics, or How to Love the Prison and Cage Oneself. The subjects and topics that people interested in current affairs deal with are seldom altogether pleasant, but usually they are not as completely unappetizing as the topics of political correctness, wokeness, identity politics, etc. either. So, it's understandable that people don't want to devote their energy and time to plain nonsense, and the author would also like to refrain from dealing with it again. If he has done so anyway and repeatedly, is not out of a genuine need, but for another simple reason. The people who propagate identitarian and woke nonsense have often crossed his path. And when one is repeatedly confronted with people who advocate childish and ridiculous assumptions, who stand out due to their bad style and phrase-like language, and at the same time proclaim that theirs is the new and inescapable way of thinking, and that anyone who does not concur was born yesterday and should be removed, then this should be repudiated. Western European societies have long been plunged into a state of emergency, dismantling bourgeois society and civilization. This particularly concerns the delegitimization of established everyday routines, habits, lifestyles, life experiences, in other words, that fine mesh and thread of human relationships that, in its entirety and with all the perspectives on life tied to it, constitutes bourgeois society, even in its hollowed out and faded form. In this respect, the time during the COVID pandemic was similar to all varieties of identity politics, wokeness, and official anti-racism, currents that have long stirred up trouble and have nothing to do with the pandemic per se, but which not coincidentally only really picked up speed in the context of the state of emergency, because their protagonists recognized their very own and then because the protagonists recognized their very own and then at work methods of governing and thus felt their time had come. In the slipstream of a regime and the policies it pursues, which only understands forms of coexistence as informal raw material and arbitrary disposable mass of its actions, all like-minded currents were encouraged and spread unrestricted, and conversely, they were and are encouraged, promoted and supported by authoritative political forces, and find their like-minded mouthpieces and advocates in the media. Every human society is necessarily based on criteria of inclusion. which at the same time act as a criteria of exclusion. Certain demands are placed on people, which decide whether an individual belongs or not. Capital, as a paradoxical social relation that, quote, socializes people by driving people apart, isolating people, and thus rendering people subjects, adds a further criterion to the existing criteria. Only the monetary need counts and can be satisfied, but with money in one's pocket one can afford the wealth of the, quote, immense collection of goods, end quote. This is the unwritten but consistently effective general clause of the modern social contract and the prerequisite for being considered a full member of society. Otherwise, however, in the post-bourgeois society, which has abolished the liberal class privilege and leveled out educational privileges, there are no de facto and no de jure restrictions on access to civic life, training, professions, etc., and participation in public life in general, visits to cultural venues, restaurants, etc. Identity and diversity politics essentially consist of establishing a regime which entails that everyone has to show their ID to everyone else without being asked, i.e. voluntarily expose themselves as an identity in public, i.e. completely self-determined as a representative of some collective, which means that in the case which people have the misfortune of being white, male, and older, they have to squirm with contrition over their supposed privileges. What used to be executed only by public or state authorities set up specifically for this purpose, identifying a person as such on the basis of certain characteristics and then issuing them with an ID, this bureaucratic procedure is now carried out by individuals at their own peril. Footnote. Christoph Turka, in 1987, was, as far as I know, the first to trace identitarianism back to this very prosaic bureaucratic procedure. End footnote. This is the core of the postmodern neoliberally organized and moderated, quote, self-determination, that the subjectivized individuals behave like a bureaucracy or authority and demand this act of self-determination from everyone else. And postmodern identity politics essentially consists of nothing other than expanding or diversifying this act of bureaucratic arbitrariness and self-determination to an immeasurable degree and merging it with the drives of each individual by staging them as a recurring experience. Identity is the result not only of active identification, but first and foremost of being identified, and this is executed by a dominant agency, what sociologists and other professional interpreters celebrate as, quote, individualization. It means that everyone now has to submit himself to this procedure in a cost-saving and resource-saving manner, and conversely behave like bureaucrats towards their fellow human beings. However, a society in which this behavior was practiced across the board would no longer be a society. It would be a kind of open-air prison whose individual cells would be fenced-in reserves in which ultimately only one person would live at a time, because according to the insane logic of every identity politics, every person is so different that even addressing another person inappropriately, and even more so in the institution of language itself, constitutes a discriminatory assault. If people are not regarded as different in their fundamental equality, but conversely only as equal in their fundamental identity and, quote, diversity, then the necessary result is anomie. The society in South Africa, for example, a country which has a great deal of experience with apartheid, reservations, and homelands, is rapidly approaching these conditions. Now under black supremacy, and other societies have also embarked on this path. Identity as a concept unites absolutely contradictory terms and conditions. On the one hand, it is a philosophical and logical concept that denotes absolute unity, which in itself knows no divisiveness and no contradiction. In other words, a unity that exists beyond all differences and is superior to them. This idea of the all one is not only consistently applied to God in the European tradition, because that which is not limited, restricted, and finite, like human beings, is divine. In this respect, identity thus denotes a substantial and objective being that bears the insignia of the divine. On the other hand, in the wake of, quote, revised psychoanalysis, end quote, or, quote, ego psychology, and in common parlance, identity means something like a person's self-image, their sense of self, their distinctiveness, or their, quote, core of being, end quote, which survives all changes in life and is itself unchangeable. In other words, something extremely subjective. It is G.W.F. Hegel's achievement, and incidentally demonstrates how true to life Hegel's thinking, generally reviled as detached, really is. That Hegel recognized the idea of absolute individual unity, parentheses, schematically represented as A equals A, end parentheses, as a completely empty and void determination, and thus subjected to an ultimate and insuperable critique. Hegel shows that there is no immediate identity and no generality, quote, in itself, end quote, but it is a determination that only ever shows itself in the particular and finite things and the individual people, but even the particular is not identical with the particular's self, but contradictory in the particular self and therefore alive, because it must always move away from itself and renounce itself. Identity can therefore not be a fixable determination or a stable state, but only the temporal and inconclusive process of alienation and reappropriation, the movement of a thing in its contradictions. According to Hegel, the assertion of a static, contradiction-free identity is rather an indication of a limited, narrow-minded consciousness that sticks strictly to itself and its principles and wants to shape the world accordingly, a consciousness that can be seen in the moralism that was already rampant in the 19th century and against which Hegel very much liked to polemicize. Sigmund Freud's achievement, in turn, consists in the fact that Freud, from a different perspective than Hegel, both commensurable insights, emphasized the equally simple and fundamental, biopsychologically founded non-identity of the human being, namely that humans are needy natural beings who have always sprung from the nature from which they originate and to which they belong. For in order to maintain themselves and satisfy their needs, humans, in contrast to animals, which follow their instincts and are therefore, quote, immediately one with their immediately one with their, the animals, and life activity, end quote, Marx, must relate to their own kind, to themselves, i.e. their inner nature, and to the world, i.e. external nature, and behave towards it. People are driven by the elementary necessity of life, i.e. people's needs and unconscious, ultimately sexual desires and fantasies, but can only satisfy these desires and needs via the, quote, detour of work and thought, i.e. purposeful, practical, spiritual activity. The individually conscious, quote, rational objectives are thus always and inevitably a symptom of drive-power desires, their objectification and rationalization, and conversely, these drives only come to light in the objectifications and purposeful activity, must objectify themselves via the detour, through which they are, on the other hand, inhibited, postponed, mediated, and reflectively broken. With every breath, where the hell am I? With every breath, every action, every effort to think, we move away from ourselves, and in this way can we remain, quote, close to ourselves, end quote. In this continuous movement, quote, away from us towards us, end quote, which constitutes life, all possible identifications with human role models, with things, with ideals, etc., naturally play a prominent role, but identifications are followed by rejection reactions, or every identification already contains a rejection in itself, as is directly the case with counter-identifications. Under no circumstances, however, does the process of identification end in a final state that could be called a permanent and stable identity. This fairy tale was only created by psychoanalytical revisionism. C. Schneider, 1994. Identity is therefore either an empty, impossible definition or a phantasm, and equally void in both respects. Nobody knows what it is and what it is supposed to be. Identity, neither do I, but conversely, one can state very precisely what happens when someone claims to know their identity, or when they act as if there is a fixed and stable personal identity. Claiming identity and asserting it can mean nothing other than a defense against the experience of fundamental non-identity. The certainly painful but also exhilarating experience of all the ambivalences to which we are exposed by virtue of our biopsychic constitution, and escape from the human freedom that this entails and the refusal to cope with it. Asserting identity is a logically impossible and practically absurd endeavor, that consist of confining oneself, barracking oneself, thereby libidinally occupying the act of self-barracking and confinement, and subjectively appropriating it as a form of religious confession. To put it another way, a short circuit is staged between the logical objective and emotional subjective determination of identity. And from this perspective, the only possible answer to the question of what identity is a prison that one has created for oneself, or to put it more existentially, hell. That is, quote, I myself, end quote. The average social character of a person who brags about their white, black, national, fluid, trans, etc. identity can therefore be portrayed as follows. By rejecting their own constitutive ambivalences, the character is fundamentally witless and humorless, allergic to all ambiguities and subtleties, always on the lookout and on the verge of interpreting such experiences as an attack on their own person and reacting accordingly in a huffy, offended, and snotty manner. And conversely, a person who marks themselves as identitarian must always be eager to emphasize cleanliness and unambiguity in their thinking and speaking. Their way of expressing themselves is correspondingly stereotypical, sterile, and intimidated, radiating a correspondingly deadly boredom. People fixated on identity are constitutively incapable of making experiences because the entire world, the external world, people, things, events, as well as their own inner world and their own body and its impulses, is derealized and devalued, i.e. devalued and treated as raw material and material for self-expression. A fundamental reversal thus takes place. Individuals do not waste their selves and their energy unreservedly on the world in order to grow through their experience of the world, but the other way around. They draw the world into their bleak and, quote, gloomy passion, end quote. Fowler, 2002. Use the world as a vehicle for self-discovery and self-expression and only acknowledge that which benefits them. The identitarian social character therefore lives in the self-created contradiction that although it pretends to be absolutely at peace with itself, to embody unity without contradiction, and therefore to be purely directed internally, it is de facto purely externally directed and obsessively fixated on others, since the outside world fills only one function for it, to confirm it in its grandiose identity. The only intention of this character is therefore to render the world and everything that exists in the same, so that nothing about it disturbs its own self-image and no longer poses a threat. This is why every character constituted in this way must, on the one hand, gather all kinds of like-minded people around them who continually confirm their identity fad. But because all corresponding characters are constituted in the same way, and each one must give their, quote, identity absolute validity and therefore claim to be different from all others, such sectarian or racket-like associations are usually quite short-lived. In other words, every identity apostle is an enemy of everyone else, and they are only temporarily united when it comes to asserting their identity as such against everyone else. The domineering relationship that each individual cultivates towards themselves and others is repeated in the relationship between rackets and the rest of society, in the form of religious zealotry, propaganda, and blackmailing larmoyance about the alleged suppression and discrimination of some identity. Looks like larmoyant means to be tearful and snivel, to weep, shed tears. Interesting word. Larmoyant means inclined to cry or weep, or with much crying and weeping. Identity politics is the political management of this individual inclination or whim by individuals or individuals aggregated into sects, rackets, or movements, and that means it is basically no longer, quote, politics at all, but a confession articulated in the form of politics, a kind of religion but without theology. The appropriate political justification generally used to rationalize the need for identity is the fight against foreign domination, in which the defense and fight against everything foreign has always tended to outweigh the fight against and the pushing back of domination. As a struggle against the foreign domination of the aristocratic and clerical classes, which were reviled as parasitic, the struggle is genuinely bourgeois. Its social result was, fashionably speaking, the quote outsourcing of the third estate as pars pro toto of the people, and its quote self-determination, i.e. self-rule. In the form of anti-imperialism, it is the ideology of the German bourgeoisie that came too late, which fatally spread to the socialist communist movement and especially to the anti-colonial movements. Anti-imperialism was already identity politics when the term was still unknown, and conversely, today's identity politics peddles the collected platitudes of left-wing anti-imperialism under the labels, quote, post-colonialism, or, quote, critical whiteness, and works diligently to unite identitarians of all countries against the dead white European male, and not only ultimately against the Jews and the Jews' state, which is agitated against as a, quote, colonial apartheid state, end quote. And just as consistently, it is so-called postmodernism in most of its varieties that functions as a, quote, philosophical rationalization of the identitarian need, as it fully corresponds to its basic provisions, translates them into a quote elevated esoteric jargon, and in this way awards permanence to the need and gives it confirmation. Just as identity is an objectless phantasm, postmodernism is founded on nothing and must therefore stage a series of short circuits in postmodernism's approach and in each of postmodernism's movements of thought. Postmodernism proclaims the alleged, quote, end. Excuse me. Where the hell am I? Sorry, something came up on my screen. I had to close it. Postmodernism is founded on nothing and must therefore stage a series of short circuits in postmodernism's approach and in each of postmodernism's movements of thought. Postmodernism proclaims the alleged, quote, end of the grand narratives, end quote, and in contrast propagates the, parenthesis, nominalist nihilist, end parenthesis, worldview of the groundlessness and insubstantiality of all phenomena in the world. They are nothing more than an unconnected chaotic multiplicity called, quote, diversity or, quote, variety, depending on taste. But it is precisely this assumption that is the greatest narrative of all, and the most perverse metaphysical assumption of all, because it does not even know or want to admit that it is one. And this unconscious and inconsistent short-circuiting back and forth between extremely opposing and irreconcilable assumptions is reproduced continuously and directed towards every topic. This is why postmodernists can agitate against identity in the sense of supposedly discriminatory, quote, definitions and, quote, attributions, and in the same breath declare identity to be sacrosanct as a self-determined confessionism. A self-determined confession. I don't know why I said confessionism. This is why postmodern identitarianism is not, quote, thinking in the true sense of the word, but a way of thinking that exercises thinking, strictly organized non-thought and methodologically pimped-out absurdity that fits the absurdity and thoughtlessness of identitarian self-assurance like a glove. This is why much work in the academy today is academically processed activism made reputable in this way. We are dealing here with a form of thinking that is not a theory, i.e. does not make any factual statements about a specific subject, but rather represents an arrangement of sentences and slogans that exclusively have a strategic and tactical meaning. These do not make any factual or substantive sense, but are identification markers that indicate whether one belongs to the initiated and chosen, parenthesis, i.e. the, quote, woke, in parenthesis, or to the enemy. The statement, for example, that there is no, parenthesis, objective, and parenthesis, truth, but that the validity of any discourse is based on power is not a diagnosis of society, but a self-description of postmodern actors, namely that the postmodern actors' approach is pure power politics, and that these postmodern actors would like to have all the power in the world. When these postmodern actors talk about a discourse, quote, inscribing that discourse's self into those subjected to that discourse, the postmodernists are revealing that the postmodernist actors want to inscribe the postmodern actors' phrase-like jargon into all who are exposed to the postmodern actors' grasp. And when they eloquently invoke, quote, structural racism, end quote, in Western societies, this reveals the barely concealed intention of transforming reasonably bourgeois societies into race-like tribal societies with neatly segregated reservations. Postmodern identity politics have become so loud and dominant in the last 25 years, not because postmodern identity politics have such convincing and cogent arguments, but because postmodern identity politics are so well networked, quote, rhizomatically, among each other and stand their ground via ruthless power politics, which also includes taking advantage of the bad conscience and concessions of established institutions in society, and the helplessness and insecurity of their opponents without a second thought. This helplessness also includes the assumption that it is necessary to discuss the content with the representatives of postmodern identity politics in the sense of academic honesty in order to refute them. But you can't refute a theory that doesn't take itself seriously, and you can't debate with people who systematically ridicule themselves. Identity politics is no sense and no higher purpose in identity politics' self. All the institutes, workshops, and initiatives in this regard are nothing more than training camps in which people practice accepting the concentrated absurdity of identity political activism and executing it on themselves and recruiting new blood. They are simply experimental laboratories for a totalitarian rule. This is why no discussion is possible with postmodern identitarians, and any refutation of their assumptions is pointless, because they are taking care of that themselves. What matters is to play their own tune back at them and to everyone else, i.e. their method of power, which they continuously practice publicly, but at the same time hide behind their bombastic words. What matters here is to shed all shyness and deliberately, calculatedly, and intelligently violate academic integrity. The problem with any kind of identity folly and its political management does not result from the folly itself. There are always misguided and crazy people, and in themselves they are at most annoying, but no more than that. But it is the conditions that make this craziness possible and hegemonic. The general condition is undoubtedly capital, which is based on the dispersion and isolation of people, and in conjunction with the modern state, constitutes each individual as the owner or, quote, sovereign of the self, end quote, i.e. as a subject who understands itself as the absolute point of accountability for its actions and the center of social events and, quote, society, i.e. all other people and things as raw material of its aspirations and actions. Objectively, we are all forced to act in this subject form as an objectively inverted, quote, crazy form. Objectively, we are all forced to act in this subject form as an objectively inverted, quote, crazy form, end quote, and are invited, but of course not condemned, to appropriate this craziness individually. In particular and currently, this, quote, subjectivation of individuals is the outstanding feature of the postmodern neoliberal regime that has been developing for over 30 years, which above all seeks to theoretically delegitimize and practically dismantle and reorganize those moments of sociality that have given the, quote, administered world a sometimes almost, quote, socialist character, even in the West. The consonance of mass production and mass consumption, the system of directly state-run or supervised public services, from healthcare, public transport, schools, and universities, to the mass media of radio/television, mass democracy with the major popular parties, the institutionalization and juridification of the class struggle, etc. The politics of privatization of social institutions and the quote individualization, i.e., the subjectivization of social affairs, is intended to erase this reverence, as it were, and wipe out any historical traces. In other words, the society in which we live is a permanent demolition project. It is the quote administered world of yesterday that is desperately trying to shed its collective character, deny its social nature, and replace it with a world that is both quote self-administered and quote supervised, without being able to achieve these goals. This is because scrapping is a state-driven and moderated process that does not weaken public institutions but strengthens them and gives them a new function. They mutate into welfare and mothering institutions, and accordingly, the scrappers act as caregivers. However, this scrapping is not just about certain historical forms of sociality, but about a general attack on bourgeois society and bourgeois culture itself and all its attributes: prosperity, reason, autonomous art. No one should expect anything from the future anymore. Articulating life prospects that extend beyond the now is considered disreputable. Instead, a lack of prospects is propagated as a new perspective. The social, or rather, antisocial, concept that becomes apparent from such scrapping policies consists of fully realizing the destructive implications of the bourgeois subject form by propagating such concepts as quote self-determination, quote personal responsibility, quote initiative, quote self-optimization, quote empowerment, etc. The appeal is made informally and explicitly to every individual to treat themselves and their peers as if they had no history and no future, as if they had no relationships with their peers and with things, as if they were not bound to anything, not even their own body, gender, etc., but were always and everywhere available. To use the familiar terms of the British journalist David Goodhart, every person is expected not to be, quote, somewhere, i.e., to be attached to their body, their gender, their life, their friends, the area in which they live, a particular activity, etc., but, quote, anywhere, end quote, i.e., just like capital, always and everywhere at the same time, fluid, adaptable, and pliable. And to kindly declare this untenable and unrealistic state of affairs their identity. David Goodhart, born September 1956, is a British journalist, commentator, and author. He is the founder and former editor of Prospect magazine. It says, Goodhart first wrote that, quote, sharing and solidarity can conflict with diversity, end quote, in an essay titled Too Diverse, published by Prospect in February 2004. Trevor Phillips, then chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality, describes such arguments as being those of, quote, liberal Powellites, end quote, after the conservative politician Enoch Powell. In the book, The British Dream, Successes and Failures of Post-War Immigration, Goodhart argues that high immigration can undermine national solidarity and be a threat to social democratic ideals about a welfare state. Goodhart advocates that immigration to the United Kingdom should be reduced and more emphasis put on integrating immigrants. The Road to Somewhere was published in 2017. A fault line in Britain existed, he suggested, between, quote, somewheres, those people firmly connected to a specific community which consists of about half the population, quote, in-betweeners and, quote, anywheres, those usually living in cities who are socially liberal and well-educated, the latter being only a minority of about 20 to 25% of the total population, but in fact had, quote, overruled, end quote, the attitudes of the majority. Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian believed it could be argued New Labour had actually often had the somewheres in mind in policies espousing a, quote, abso culture and the, quote, prison works attitude which they continued from Michael Howard's earlier period as Home Secretary. Writing for the Daily Telegraph in 2018, Goodhart described the Windrush scandal as, quote, an era of overzealous control, end quote, which, quote, must not lead to a radical watering down of the so-called, quote, hostile environment, end quote, end quote. So it sounds like this guy's politics are kind of whack, or weird, at least. Prospect is a monthly British general interest magazine specializing in politics, economics, and current affairs. Topics covered include British and other European as well as U.S. politics, social issues, art, literature, cinema, science, the media, history, philosophy, and psychology. Prospect features a mixture of lengthy analytic articles, first-person reportage, one-page columns, and shorter items. Back to the text. As a, quote, subject, the individual in this perspective is nothing more than a pure, quote, life entrepreneur, end quote, who no longer places only a part of itself, i.e. its labor power, but simply everything it is and has, its entire material existence and mental potency, quote, in the service, end quote, not of a thing or even another person, but in the service of an abstraction that only presents itself as a thing and a process, namely capital. This is the point at which postmodern identity politics, as the, quote, cultural program, end quote, of a development that deprived people of the material foundations of a good life, come into play. All these trends do nothing other than pronounce this demand on the individual to be, quote, anywhere, in principle, and to actively prove this through lifelong and prospectless self-training and self-optimization as a moral imperative and subjective commitment. The, quote, wokeness on display is not just an opportunistic marketing move by certain companies, it is that too, but stems from the insane logic of capital itself, which in its constitutive lack of prospects and notorious crisis, reveals itself to be the poorly profaned religious cult of sacrifice that capital has always been. The champions of wokeness, who are consistently recruited from the academically educated, mobile, and, quote, progressive, urban bobo milieu, plagued by constant fears of decline, are, regardless of what they think of themselves and however anti-capitalist they may be, the pseudo-enlightened high priest of capital that only has one inner destiny, to abstract from all found material things and shaped forms of life in order to appropriate them as material exploitation, i.e. to, quote, capitalize them as an ideal of, quote, diversity. An ideal that they themselves ruthlessly enforce against their peers, but above all against the quote, unteachable and, quote, backward, quote, somewheres, with the encouragement and backing of state authorities. This is the reason for the essentially very strange phenomenon, which requires explanation, that the most unpleasant and doctrinaire mouthpieces of identity politics are so courted, protected, and defended against all attacks by established authorities, because they embody, as it were, the purest form, in the purest form, the state's momentum. They know how to consciously spell out the tendency of what the state has been executing for a long time as the new norm and ideologize the necessary adaptations for it as chic, quote, nonconformity conformism, end quote. Berger, 2001. And, as was the case almost exactly 100 years ago, is once again mainly outcast and mentally homeless intellectuals who are open to all absurdities and disgraceful deeds and are therefore ready to give themselves up unconditionally. Taken together, the state and its devoted activist apron form a, quote, anti-elitist elite, end quote, which makes no effort to disguise that the time of oligarchic class rule is over, but that today's elite consists of characterless, i.e., completely fungible, interchangeable figures who communicate with their clothing, habitus, language, appearance, and physiognomy, that they no longer want to represent an elite, but could just as easily belong in the Blockupy camp or in another gutter. See Grau 2017, Kistler 2020. They are only elite in the purely negative sense that they form a closed-up society and in principle no longer take formal legitimation by the majority into account in their method of governance and therefore prefer to assert themselves through indoctrination and propaganda with a strong tendency towards religious zealotry. The rampant search for identity, and even more so any identity of politics, is a symptom of the crisis-ridden disintegration of society, and the attempts in it, and at the same time, the fundamentally insane and impossible attempt to overcome this crisis-ridden disintegration in a regressive and barbaric way, namely by settling into this disintegration and declaring disintegration to be the strategic program and political perspective. This is, in a short and by no means abbreviated formula, the essence of German ideology, anti-imperialism, and German disaster politics, as it was practiced and exported after 1933, and has served as a model for all like-minded movements ever since. The crisis-ridden collapse of welfare state, quote, people's capitalism, end quote, and its, quote, coping, end quote, with identity politics, which has been in full swing in Western countries in particular since the 1990s, had its first manifestations in countries of the, quote, third world, where the politics of, quote, catch-up development, which, however socialistically draped, was in many cases oriented towards ideals of civility and enlightenment, and whose goal was an orderly and self-reproducing community, had already been in crisis everywhere since the 1970s. And even if it wasn't called that at the time, identity movements were now appearing on the scene, systematically delegitimizing and scraping civility and secular perspectives on life. Scrapping civility and secular perspectives on life. The destruction of orderly sociality went hand in hand with the rise of identity politics, which articulated itself as a, quote, return to indigenous religion and culture. In the Arab world, North Africa, and even in the Far East, as progressive Islamization, which was given a powerful boost by the seizure of power by the mullahs in Iran. In Latin America and Africa as recourse to so-called, quote, indigenous traditions, end quote, which then culminated in the legalization of indigenous popular justice in Bolivia under Evo Morales, for example. Not just for over 40 years, but definitely since then, everyone is able to tell what a politics organized with reference to identity means in practice and what its social results are. As an attempt to make a phantasm, quote, true, the invocation of identity can mean nothing other than the permanent mobilization against a universal enemy that supposedly sabotages, thwarts, makes impossible the invoked absolute unity, and which therefore should be finally eradicated. The invocation of such a unity, which is removed from the crisis-ridden signs of disintegration, and which one wants to restore, any politics that is pursued in this sense, thus unleashes the crisis-ridden disintegration of individuals and society all the more, and perpetuates it for an unforeseeable period of time. Identity politics is a cult of prescribed lifelessness, a proclaimed self-sacrifice, and ultimately of death. And the only thing that matters to all regimes in this regard is to draw as many people as possible into this destructive cult. The cliques that create and moderate this cult are therefore, by their very nature, all ultimately suicide cults, and it's only the fortuitous favor of certain circumstances that prevents them from drawing the full consequences from the insane logic of their enterprise. Conversely, this means that wherever they have free rein and favorable circumstances allow them to feel powerful as a norm, the asocial, destructive, and bestial consequences can be seen in their purest form. Whereas today in Lebanon, for example, where Hezbollah, or in the Gaza Strip where Hamas still rules, quote, society, end quote, an association of people for self-preservation, has been replaced by a gangland where, with reference to glorious Islam, a production of death and prospective demise has been installed, i.e., all the institutions that would normally be used for the purpose of preservation of life, such as companies, kindergartens, hospitals, universities, etc., have been, quote, repurposed here and serve as retreats as well as outposts in the incessant battle against the universal enemy, which has been identified in the Jews and their state. The, quote, welfare state, end quote, charitable measures of the Islamist fascists and their anti-Jewish campaign of extermination are two sides of the same coin. An economy of extermination run by militant sects whose leaders hold their followers hostage with charitable gifts and keep them happy so that they can be sacrificed without hesitation if needed. And even if not all identitarian regimes draw exactly these consequences from their undertaking, they recognize each other in case of doubt and are always united as a unanimous front when it comes to propaganda campaigns against Israel or supporting their forerunners, Islamist fascists, with weapon donations of all kinds. Chavez/Maduro's Venezuela, currently also Colombia with a former guerrillero at the helm, the mullah's Iran, the racially diversified regime in South Africa, etc. The Punch and Judy show of identity politics, with its absurd debates and conceptual contortions, is dispensable where identity politics is practiced on a large scale. Where action is taken, the speechless command prevails, which the woke and identitarians in the West secretly or openly admire and work towards self-realizing. Sorry, I had to look this up. Punch and Judy is a traditional puppet show of Italian origin featuring Mr. Punch and his wife Judy. The performance consists of a sequence of short scenes, each depicting an interaction between the two characters, most typically the anarchic Mr. Punch and one other character who usually falls victim to the intentional violence of Punch's slapstick. First appearing in England in 1662, Punch and Judy was called by the Daily Telegraph, quote, a staple of the British seaside scene, end quote. The various episodes of Punch comedy, often provoking shocked laughter, are dominated by the clowning of Mr. Punch. The show is performed by a single puppeteer inside the booth, known since Victorian times as a, quote, professor or, quote, punchman, and assisted sometimes by a, quote, bottler, who corrals the audience outside the booth, introduces the performance, and collects the money, quote, the bottle, end quote. The bottler may also play accompanying music or sound effects on a drum or guitar and engage in back chat with the puppets, sometimes repeating lines that may have been difficult for the audience to understand. In the Victorian era, the drum and panpipes were the instruments of choice. Today, most professors work solo. Indeed, the need for a bottler became less important when street performing with the show gave way to paid engagements at private parties or public events. In modern shows, the audience is encouraged to participate, calling out to the characters on the stage, typically shouting, quote, he's behind you, to warn them of danger or clue them in to what is going on behind their backs. Okay, so back to the text. I had to look that up. In all the aforementioned and similar developments on the world's periphery, Western intellectuals have always been ready to give their highest blessing to even the most repulsive gangster regimes and the most heinous acts in the name of, quote, cultural sensitivity or, quote, cultural identity, and with reference to the, quote, guilt or, quote, privileges of the, quote, white man that need to be removed. And they do it methodologically equipped and, quote, empowered by, quote, identity studies, such as, quote, post-colonialism, untouched by empirical evidence and hermetically sealed against experience, like the dreadful Judith Butler et al., who do not even want to condemn the high-powered killers of Hamas. Back in the 1970s, Intellectuals are already warming up to the anti-modern slogan of the, quote, end of grand narratives, end quote, in order to pander to the ruling powers in the imminent scrapping of universal, indiscriminately addressed bourgeois perspectives on life that are in principle accessible to all. A slogan that expresses the fact that they would like the populations of the West to share in the social blessings that the cashing in of such perspectives had already brought in the, quote, third world. And with this in mind, there are tireless calls for people to finally leave their, quote, comfort zone, give up cherished, quote, vested interests, renounce the prosperity they have achieved, and finally learn to, quote, renegotiate life every day. Anomic conditions are seriously presented as a new perspective. And because the worst intentions always have to be covered by the highest ideals, the anti-imperialist exaggerated identity fad also comes into play here. Because, quote, the whites are, quote, guilty of colonialism, racism, imperialism, etc., and are, quote, privileged in general, they must now practice active repentance, transform their communities into, quote, multicultural and, quote, diversity sensitive, end quote, events, open their borders indiscriminately to all who want to enter, to those who are actually persecuted, as well as to all those many fellow travelers who are the reason for the flight of others, and who guarantee that they will continue their evil destructive machinations in the metropolises not only propagandistically, but also practically. This is undoubtedly hatred. There is undoubtedly hatred of Jews in Western countries, but that which is openly acknowledged and acted out without hesitation, as can be seen after the Hamas massacre of October 7th, 2023, is the imported product of a completely misguided and potentially suicidal immigration politics. But the anti-Semitism of Arab immigrants and refugees in the West has so far been just as protected by society as honor killings, knife attacks, and other blessings of multiculturalism. An informal ban of silence or criticism applies to them, and anyone who violates is labeled as, quote, controversial, i.e. in plain language, branded as, quote, right-wing, or as a, quote, Nazi. The search for identity is a fad and identity politics a folly, and both together are a symptom of crisis. There has probably never been an ideology as thin, as flimsy, and transparent as the woke and identitarian ideologies of the present in their various colorations of one and the same stereotype. Nevertheless, the whole folly has now become more than just a nuisance, as it enjoys institutional backing and support, and above all, those states that, like Germany, have no significant binding forces, are only too happy to succumb to the deadly pull emanating from conformist fools and reputable sects. And the respectable fools, for their part, are rallying internationally against everything that represents the West, and especially against Israel. If the folly is put into practice, people are guaranteed to fall by the wayside. Talking about identity politics and identity politics consequences is therefore not a luxurious discussion, because you can't think of anything better at the moment, but because there are very fundamental things at stake. The fact that this trivial phenomenon is an expression of a powerful tendency should not diminish resistance, but rather spur it on. The attempt to define the enemy, as undertaken here, should help to maintain a clear overview in the cultural civil war that identity apostles have de facto long since declared, to conserve and bundle one's own forces, and then above all, to be able to launch attacks that hit the enemy in such a way that he can no longer recover from them. Addendum on Race and Anti-Racism. This is by Clemens Nachtmann, 2004. At a time when left-wing intellectuals were intoxicated by the struggle of the, quote, peoples of the, quote, third world against, quote, imperialism, when protesting students were shouting, quote, victory in the people's war, end quote, from the top of their lungs, when pale bourgeois sons and daughters were training in all seriousness the words of Chairman Mao, whose Erkenntniskraft was roughly on par with those columns in colorful magazines entitled Fragen Sie Frau Barbara, Ask Mrs. Barbara. In short, when leftists were already mentally preparing for a national uprising at home, for which they had to wait a few more years, namely until 1989, the year of the German Intifada. At that time, from 1967 to 1969, there was an uprising, largely unnoticed in the public, more than 1,000 kilometers away on the island of Anguilla in the Caribbean, which was not a people's uprising, but one of the people. Quote, the rebellion... Shit, is that a quote? Yeah, quote. Wait, is this a quote? I don't fucking know. It's not, there's no, like, citation to it, so I don't know. I don't think it's actually a quote, so... Sorry. The rebellion would not have happened without another small island state, St. Kitts and Nevis. For administrative reasons, Great Britain merged its colonies Anguilla and St. Kitts and Nevis into one island state. However, apart from their geographical proximity, these two states have nothing in common. ... During the rebellion, there was open hostility between the two islands. The inhabitants of St. Kitts found the Anguillans provincial, called them, quote, Bobo Johnnies, which meant fools, and made them the target of their ridicule. The Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, refused to allow Anguilla any real representation in the joint government and mercilessly boycotted the smaller island's already weak economy. The Anguillans felt hurt and exploited by the arrogant attitude of the Kittians. Enlightened foreign rule. In 1967, Britain tried to rid itself of its Caribbean colonies and force Anguilla into a long-term union with the dreaded St. Kitts and Nevis by giving it de jure independent status as an associated state. But Anguilla, unwilling to even strengthen this alliance, resisted. The rebels waved Union Jacks and banners with slogans like, quote, we don't want sovereignty, we want England, end quote. ... However, Britain, could not be dissuaded from its neat solution to the disorderly political problems in the Caribbean. In February, the independent state of St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla was created. On this day of mourning, Anguillans carried a black-veiled coffin bearing the words, quote, sovereignty around the island in a silent march. Tensions between Anguilla and St. Kitts and Nevis continued to escalate. The rebels burnt down the Parliament building. Thereupon, Her Majesty's governor ran away. Furthermore, the rebels sent 12 police officers detached from St. Kitts to hell. Finally, on the 19th of March, 1969, the British marched into Anguilla with a battalion of 338 men, including the Royal Navy and the Red Devils, a paratrooper unit. The elite fighting force was greeted at sandy ground by children with flowers and candy, by their beaming parents with, quote, God save the Queen, end quote, and the usual contingent of goats. Not one shot was fired during the invasion, ... Due to the reaction of the world public, Great Britain was forced to reconsider its position. Some troops were ordered to remain on Anguilla to help build roads, lay telephone lines, and construct a long-needed jetty. Britain thus resumed full responsibility for the island, and Anguilla became, of its own free will, once again a colony of the British Commonwealth, ... In the end, Anguilla had achieved what it wanted, to determine its political status itself. End quote. So that was a quote. That was just a very long quote. End quote. Schwab, 1995. Remarkable about these events are several things. Not only the pleasantly sober materialistic calculus of the islanders concerning their own advantage and well-being, the bluntly expressed insight that those who make life miserable and unpleasant are generally one's own relatives and acquaintances and not some strangers, so that the due abolition of rule is not up for debate. If the due abolition of rule is not up for debate for the time being, Enlightened foreign rule is always preferable to despotism of native tormentors. That identity means death and national sovereignty means the grave. This fundamental insight, as developed, for instance, in Hegel's philosophy of the state, has been spontaneously realized by the islanders. One does not have to study philosophy for 20 semesters to understand this simple insight. It rather takes a considerable amount of subjectively acquired delusion to deny it. New section, the change of ideology. But it was precisely this denial that had been the social norm in the so-called, quote, Third World since the time after the First World War, and even more so after the Second World War. In a time of national revolutionary ethnic awakenings, the inhabitants of Anguilla, or, for example, an Aimé Césaire, even though, as will be mentioned later, was himself a cultural relativist of the purest kind, did not lead the French Antillean Islands to independence, but rather annexed them to the mother country, stood quite alone. For the vast majority of the so-called, quote, national liberation movements, end quote, it was a foregone conclusion that progress was synonymous with the promotion of the colonies to national sovereign states. National sovereignty, which was said then and still is today, is the prerequisite for development based on the disposal of the people over their resources, and is realized in the isolation from the world market, having as its goal the catch-up development of an independent, self-supporting national economy, and can, only when this development of catching up has been achieved, sometime in the distant future, be open to the world market again. Thus, in the full-scale decolonization that began after 1945, a conception of economy and sovereignty prevailed, which had been formulated for the first time shortly before the middle of the 19th century, also in a developed country, namely in Germany. Referenced here is Friedrich List, who was like a big economic nationalist guy. I think there's a book about List called something like List versus Marx about national economy. I'm not sure who wrote that, though. Reference here is Friedrich List, who in 1841 outlined a political economy of catch-up development that would bring Germany on par with England and allow Germany to play an equal part in the, quote, concert of nations. One second. The description on Amazon of this book, The National System of Political Economy by Friedrich List, says, in the national system of political economy, List provides a critique of the ideas of Adam Smith and David Ricardo that continue to resonate with policymakers concerned with industrial policy and national economic development. List argues that in contrast with the stylized view of classical economics, real-world economies are organized along national lines, and that policymakers can ignore this reality to their peril. The benefits from trade are conditional rather than universal, and the development of sophisticated industry requires carefully designed and sequentially planned state interventions. This provides an early recognition of the existence of distinct stages of economic development and of the interplay between military power, industrial development, and national prosperity. List's work had a formative influence on subsequent strands of thought, such as institutional economics and national systems of innovation, end quote, perspectives, and is considered an exemplary work in the tradition of realist international political economy. Back to the text. The fact that List entitled his work The National System of Political Economy already marks the formation of the front against the political economy of English or French provenance, and already indicates the overturning of ideology into lies and delusion that was to hit political economy only later. Quote, finally, it is characteristic that the German bourgeoisie begins with the lie with which the French and English bourgeoisie ends, after reaching a position where it is compelled to apologize for itself, to offer excuses for its existence, end quote. Marx. Ideology turns into a lie when, as in the case of List, human sentiment triumphs over factual knowledge, the free-spirited handling of facts that does not name what is offensive, but, quote, rethinks and even passes off the subjective willful act as the essence of the matter. This total idealism condemns the procedure of immanent critique, i.e., critique through exposition, which Marx was able to employ with Ricardo, for example, to failure from the outset. No wonder, then, that Marx, noticeably exasperated in the face of List's bombastic phraseology, and obviously disgusted by his transparent, vain exposition of political conviction, shows himself full of lavish praise for the, quote, frank, classic cynicism with which the English and French bourgeoisie, as represented by its first, at least at the beginning of its domination, scientific spokesman of political economy, elevated wealth into a god and ruthlessly sacrificed everything else to wealth, to this Moloch, in science as well, end quote. Marx. Because the ruthlessness of theory denotes the excessiveness of capital in reality, and because of capital's excessiveness as the multiplication of everything special makes tangible that unrestrained satisfaction of needs in whose name capital, which must always thwart such satisfaction, is to be put to death. That is why, quote, cynicism represents the humane, while every, quote, social attitude that wants to humanize capital is in fact barbarizing capital. Marx had already remarked on this theory that one should always flee when theory begins to feel as if human sentiment has crept in, because such coziness is the appearance of the sovereign will to totalize its grip on human capital in order to extend it to the, quote, whole human being, end quote. Quote, for this is just as vile as if a slave driver were to boast that he flourished his whip over his slaves in order that the slaves should have the pleasure of exercising their muscular power. The German Philistine is the slave driver who flourishes the whip of protective tariffs in order to instill in his nation the spirit of, quote, industrial education, end quote, and teach it to exercise its muscular powers, end quote. Marx. According to Marx, what the German national economy credits the German national economy's self with as a human attitude is nothing other than an absurd-seeming denial of reality, which we know today is, quote, political correctness. Quote, the empty, shallow, sentimental idealism of the German bourgeois, beneath which lies hidden, parenthesis, is concealed, in parenthesis, the pettiest, dirtiest, and most cowardly shopkeeper's spirit, parenthesis, soul, in parenthesis, has arrived at the epoch when this bourgeois is inevitably compelled to divulge his secret. But again, this bourgeois divulges his secret in a truly German, high-flown manner, ... He disavows wealth while striving for wealth, ... The whole theoretical part of List's system is nothing but a disguising of the industrial materialism of frank political economy in idealistic phrases. Everywhere, List allows the thing to remain in existence, but idealizes the expression of the thing. End quote. Marx.